The man who built the British East India Company's entire Asian strategy once wrote in a private letter that he had never encountered a fighting force that frightened him the way the warriors of Jolo did. He didn't publish that, he buried it. That letter survived anyway. There are two kinds of history, the kind that gets written by the winners, printed in textbooks, and handed to school children, and the kind that gets scratched into ship logs, buried in colonial archives, and quietly forgotten because it makes the wrong people look powerful. This is the second kind, the story of how Filipino warriors, specifically the Taosug fighters of the Sulu Sultanate, forced the most powerful maritime empire of the 17th century to negotiate, retreat, and eventually sign terms of peace is not taught in most classrooms, not in London, not even in Manila. The men who made it happen weren't kings or diplomats. They were sailors, raiders, warriors, and craftsmen who built weapons that the British didn't fully understand and couldn't easily counter. And the people who kept this story alive weren't historians. They were the invisible ones, the boat builders, the blacksmiths, the men who forged the Campolin blades and carved the Lantaka cannons, the ones whose names never made it onto bronze plaques. But there's a detail. This is their story. Picture the British Empire in the 1600s. Aggressive, expanding, flush with the confidence of a civilization that had already decided it owned the ocean. The East India Company was the weapon of that expansion, not a government agency, a corporation. You know, a corporation with its own army, its own navy, its own courts. It moved through Southeast Asia like it moved through everywhere else, with trade offers backed by cannon fire. That approach worked in a lot of places. Jolo was not one of those places. On the other hand, the Sulu Sultanate at that time controlled some of the most strategically critical waters in all of Southeast Asia. The passages between Borneo, Mindanao, and the Sulu archipelago were the arteries through which spice trade flowed. Whoever held those waters held something worth a fortune. The British knew it. The Spanish knew it. The Dutch knew it. What none of them fully calculated was the fighting culture that had grown up around those waters for centuries. Incidentally, the Taosug warrior tradition didn't emerge from nothing. Well, it was the product of generations of maritime conflict, against pirates, against rival sultanates, against colonial powers that kept arriving on their shores with flags and firearms. Each generation of fighters had to adapt or die. They adapted constantly. Stop. The men who actually built the weapons, the unnamed craftsmen working in the boatyards and forge houses of Jolo, were doing something remarkable. They weren't copying foreign technology. They were synthesizing it, taking what worked from every enemy they'd ever faced, stripping out what didn't, and creating something distinctly their own. Wait a second. The Lantaka was a perfect example. A bronze swivel cannon, small enough to mount on a fast boat, accurate enough to be devastating at close range. The British had larger guns, but the Taosug had more of these, and they used them from vessels, the Garai and Lanong warboats, that could move through shallow coastal waters where British ships couldn't follow. Stop and think about what that means tactically. To be honest, you have a massive warship, more firepower than anything your enemy possesses. But you can't bring that firepower to bear because the enemy simply moves into water you can't enter. Then they circle back around and hit you from an angle you didn't expect. That wasn't luck. That was doctrine. Somewhere in the account records of the East India Company from the late 1600s, there are damage reports. Ships returned to port with hull damage that the officers struggled to explain cleanly in ways that didn't make them look incompetent. One senior company factor, a man responsible for overseeing trade operations in the region, reportedly wrote to his superiors that direct engagement with Sulu war fleets was not advisable without significant reinforcement. That's corporate language for, "We are losing this." The reinforcements were slow to come. The region was far from London. Supply lines were stretched, and every attempt to establish a firm trading foothold in Sulu territory ran into the same problem. Important. The warriors didn't fight the way European military doctrine expected. They didn't form lines. They didn't wait to be engaged on terms that favored the heavier force. They raided. They withdrew. They came back at night. They struck supply routes. They used the geography, the thousands of islands, the shallow reef-laced passages, the mangrove coastlines, the way a boxer uses footwork, always moving, never where you aimed. Wait a second. The man sharpening the Campilan blade the night before a raid wasn't thinking about empire. He was thinking about his community, his coast, his family's trade routes. That specificity of purpose made him more dangerous than a mercenary who'd go home if the pace stopped. Here's what the textbooks skip entirely. Now pay attention. The Sulu Sultanate wasn't operating from a position of primitive desperation. This was a sophisticated, literate, commercially advanced society. The Sultan's court had diplomatic relationships with multiple Asian powers. The region had a functioning legal framework, trade networks that stretched from China to the Arab world, and a military structure with genuine strategic sophistication. When the British East India Company approached Sulu looking for a trading agreement and looking to establish the kind of arrangement that let them slowly convert trade partner into controlled territory, they were not dealing with a people who didn't understand what was happening. Important. The Taosug leadership had watched Spain try this for decades. They knew the playbook, and the warriors who had spent their lives mastering combat in those waters had given the Sultanate something rare, genuine military leverage. That leverage is what produced the treaty. Moving on, the specific terms, the exact date, the precise language of the agreement. These are details that historians continue to reconstruct from fragmentary sources across multiple archives. But the core of what happened is documented. The British sought formal terms. They got them. On terms that acknowledged Sulu's sovereignty. Wait a second. That doesn't happen to an empire like that unless the other side has demonstrated the capacity to make non-agreement genuinely costly. Incidentally, the sword makers of Jolo never had a monument built to them. No statue in a city square. No plaque on a harbor wall. No holiday named after the forge master who perfected the blade geometry that made the Campilan so effective in close quarters combat. But consider what they actually did. They handed the warriors of Sulu something that couldn't be bought, borrowed, or confiscated. A technological and tactical advantage built on generations of accumulated craft knowledge. That knowledge lived in the hands of unnamed men and women. It lived in the muscle memory of boat builders who knew by feel when a hull was balanced correctly for speed in choppy water. It lived in the eye of the blacksmith who knew by the color of heated bronze when the metal was ready. Empires archived the names of generals. The people who actually determine whether a civilization survives, the craftsmen, the builders, the ones who make the tools of survival, they disappear into collective anonymity. This is why the story almost disappeared entirely. But there's a detail. The reason London quietly buried this chapter runs deeper than embarrassment. Important. The British Empire's entire legitimacy in Asia rested on a narrative that it was bringing order, civilization, and modern technology to peoples who couldn't manage without it. A documented case of Filipino warriors forcing a peace treaty shattered that narrative at its foundation. So the records didn't get promoted. The dispatches stayed in boxes. The company's official histories glossed over the Sulu engagements in favor of the successes elsewhere. But the Taosug oral tradition didn't forget. Wait a second. The seafaring communities of the Sulu archipelago passed this history through story, through song, through the terminology embedded in their warrior practices. The knowledge survived in the people the British never bothered to archive. If you want to understand why this matters for the Philippines today, not as a museum piece, but as a living question about identity, about sovereignty, about who gets to write the story of a people, you need to hear the second half of what happened. Because the peace treaty wasn't the end. It was a pause. And what the British did with that pause, and what the Sulu Sultanate prepared during it, is a story that changes how you understand everything that came after. Subscribe to Echoes of Ancients if this is the kind of history you've been looking for. The story most channels won't touch because it requires actual archive work, not Wikipedia summaries. The next video goes into what happened when the pause ended. But before that continuation, consider the craftsman one more time. There's a particular kind of blacksmith's technique documented in ethnographic research on Sulu metalwork, a method of folding and tempering bronze alloys that produced lantaka cannon barrels with a specific resistance to cracking under sustained fire. Researchers who examined surviving examples of these cannons noted that the metallurgical knowledge embedded in them represented a tradition that took generations to develop. Truly develop. The man who figured out that technique didn't file a patent. He taught his son. His son taught his nephew. And that knowledge became the physical foundation of a military capacity that made a British admiral reconsider his options. That's the invisible infrastructure of history. Not the treaty, not the Sultan, not the commander on the deck of a warboat. Important. The man by the fire, shaping metal, passing forward something he barely had words for. Important. That's where this story actually lives. Now pay attention. The full picture of the 1600 Sulu-British engagements is still being reconstructed. Scholars working in the British Library's India office records, cross-referencing with documents in Spanish colonial archives and with oral historical traditions preserved in the Sulu archipelago, are finding more pieces every decade. What's emerging is a portrait of a conflict that was far more sustained, far more consequential, and far more decisive in favor of the Sulu defenders than the official record ever admitted. Now pay attention. The warriors who made a global empire sit down and negotiate terms weren't fighting with borrowed courage or desperation. Precisely desperation. They were fighting with centuries of craft, strategy, and identity behind them. They won. And somewhere in the archives of a building in London, there's a document that admits it. Truly admits. Stop. The next part of this story picks up right at the moment the British decided that open conflict wasn't working and shifted to a different strategy entirely. One that was slower, subtler, and in some ways far more dangerous than cannon fire. That story is coming.